I was raised in the Catholic Church. My family and I attended St. Anselm's Church in Chesterland, Ohio. Father Anderson was the main minister there. He was a very flamboyant dresser. He would wear these long flowing gown-like things and capes and these huge purple vestments with gold lame trim. On special occasions, he would wear a big pointy pope hat. So he would stand up there week after week, looking like a float in a Mardi Gras parade. I always assumed that he dressed that way so he'd be easier to spot from heaven. Now, despite this flamboyant appearance, I did not find Father Anderson's sermons to be at all interesting. In all fairness, I was a kid at the time, and nothing was interesting to me unless it exploded or was rolled in powdered sugar. On the ride home from church in the car, my father used to quiz me on the sermon topics. He would say, "Well, son, what was the topic of today's sermon?" And I had not paid attention. So I did the old book report trick, and I would say things like, it was about how you have to behave or Jesus will get you. And my father would say, "Very good, you were paying attention." This little quiz on the ride home took an interesting turn when one week my father asked me about the sermon topic, and I said, I don't remember. What was the topic today? And my father said, it was about how you have to be good or you'll go to hell. And that's when I realized that none of us were paying attention to Father Anderson's sermons. It was kind of an important spiritual turning point for me. Around that time, my father signed me up for catechism class, which is where you get up early on Saturday mornings and you learn about the Catholic faith. It was led by these grouchy nuns who taught us a lot of very inaccurate things about the faith. I always assumed that they were there as some kind of punishment, like, Mary Catherine, if you do that one more time, we're going to make you teach little kids about the Eucharist. One day we went on a field trip of sorts to the sanctuary so that we could look at the different objects, symbolic objects, and learn about them. As we approached, I saw that there was this big box that was covered in velvet, and it had two little doors in the front and a little gold cross on each door. I now know that's where they housed the chalice in the Catholic Church. But I didn't know that at the time. So I was so excited, what's in the box? And the nun said, God's in there. Now, it might seem strange to think that God is contained in a little box on a table somewhere in Chesterland, Ohio, but I was raised not to question adults. And in fact, it was very exciting, this thought that God is in this box. I rushed up to open the box. And the nun said, "Don't do that. He'll get out." This immediately put two pictures in my head. One was of God as a bird in a cage, and you open the cage, and he comes fluttering out, and everybody's trying to catch him, and then he ends up in the rafters somewhere, and maybe ends up getting eaten by a cat. The second picture put in my head was imagining coming home and my dad saying, "Well, son, what did you do in catechism class today?" And having to say, "Well, I opened the little box and then God came out and he was fluttering and we tried to catch him. I swear we really did try. And he got in the rafters and the cat ate him. And I'm really, really sorry." Because there's no amount of grounding that makes up for somebody's deity being eaten by a cat. So the Catholic Church just didn't work for me. But, it's hard to find another church. As Homer Simpson once said, what if we picked the wrong religion? Then every Sunday, God will just get angrier and angrier at us. And as I looked at other religions and looked at religious leaders, I found there were a lot of things that I was uncomfortable with. I saw how the church treated the gay community. I remember the priest scandals in the Catholic Church. I saw politicians, conservative politicians, twisting Jesus' message to interpret it as the exact opposite of what's actually in the Bible. I started to, for a while, think of church as a place where people go to not think for themselves. And then Stephanie was in graduate school, and she was given an assignment to go attend a church that was not her own. So she picked the Unitarian Universalist Church of Kent. Perhaps you've heard of it. And she brought me along in case, it was a cult or something. Try to make her sacrifice a goat or something. So I went along, and I was surprised to notice how many people in the congregation were people I knew through my art things or through my music projects, or just so many parts of my life were represented in that congregation. And then I saw Hal Walker, music director at the time of this church. And Hal rushed up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know you came here. Can you play music in next week's service?" And I said, No, I don't play church music. And he said, "Oh, that's okay." So I played in the next service, and I've been coming regularly ever since. That was my journey from organized religion to disorganized religion. But one thing I found in this church is that people are uncomfortable with the concept of God. And when you talk about God here, people react as if you called them out of the blue and are trying to sell them an extended warranty on their vehicle. And I get it, because we see religion being perverted and weaponized by people who are trying to justify cruelty. We also have that symbol, of God as the old white man with a beard, sitting on a throne in a robe. That just seems like a symbol of the white oligarchy. I do get the robe idea, though. If I were an all-powerful, all-seeing God, I'd get up in the morning, put on a robe, and go, "You know what? I'm just going to wear this all day." Maybe with some slippers. What are they going to do, fire me? One concept of God I like is in AA, they talk about the higher power. And it's the higher power as you see it. So it's integrated with your own personal journey and beliefs. It's not being slammed onto you. This is what God is. Another concept I like is in Hinduism, there's something called samadhi. And that term means meditating until you feel you're in union with the divine. Or as we call it in the UU church, coffee hour. One thing I noticed is that in the Old Testament, God was interacting with people all the time. He'd appear as a burning bush. He asked Abraham to sacrifice his only son, which had to have been an awkward conversation with his wife. It just seemed as if during that part of the Bible that God was almost like the nosy mother-in-law who lives next door and is always poking her head in to comment on your parenting and your finances. Leviticus was an entire book of the Bible where God is looking down at humanity and going, "Oh, just stop it. Just stop it." But where did he go? That sense that God's always there interacting with us, seems to have drifted off. There are 3 theological concepts that explain this. One of them is called fulfillment in Jesus. It's the idea that Jesus came down to earth and set things in motion that replaced the role that God had taken. Another is called the new covenant. It's the idea that God works through the believers in the church rather than through direct interaction. Another is called the mystery in faith, meaning that God's ways are mysterious and they're unknowable, and it's through faith and reliance on Scripture, prayer, and community that we connect with God rather than through direct interaction. But this keeps that gap there between us and God. And, people will strive for God at a time when people are losing faith in formal religions. Miracles sometimes feel like a solution to this because it's a straight line between God and the individual when you witness a miracle. But a lot of miracles are kind of cheesy, like I found Jesus in a tortilla. And there's room for charlatans, for people to claim to be the voice of God or to claim to understand what God intends. There's also an alarming development in the last couple of years called robotheism, And it's where people get on these programs like ChatGPT and they start asking spiritual questions, and after a while they think they're talking to God. Somebody had described this as an organism born with code yet filled with light and love. AI is fed by all our interactions on the internet, which is where the best of humanity exists. Right? What could possibly go wrong if that's your spiritual connection? All of these struggles come into focus when we're going through a really hard time in life. When I was a kid, I had a grandfather, Ralph W. Dexter. He was a biologist, specialized in ornithology, among many things. And one of the things he did was he spent many decades studying a bird called the chimney swift. And what he would do is he would set these little traps on the chimneys on the campus of Kent State University. And so a couple times a day, he would come out and check the traps, and he would, there would be the chimney swifts in there. He would take them out, and he'd put these little bracelets on them with code numbers, and he would track them. He'd weigh them and measure them, and he'd look in their nests and see how many eggs they had. And then he'd write it all in this little book, in little tiny handwriting. And then he'd hand the birds to me. And I would hold them, and I could feel them a little wiggly, and you could feel their heartbeat, and they were warm. And I'd open my hand, and they would alight. And it was beautiful. Well, my grandfather died in 1991. And when he died, a lot of people came up to me to explain what God meant, what God intended in his death. Like, God wanted another angel. God wanted help with birds in the afterlife. Just things that I could not relate to. And I thought, my grandfather was a scientist. He wouldn't have agreed with any of this. It created this sort of resistance in me when people are telling me what God means or what God is, especially in relation to my own struggles. Many years later, my wife and I had our first child, Paul, and he died unexpectedly an hour after he was born. It was the most gut-wrenching thing I've ever experienced in my life. And in the whirlwind of chaos and emotion, a social worker came into the hospital room, and he said to me, "Your son will come and appear to you many times in the coming weeks and months." And I remember thinking, I'm trying to survive right now. I'm not looking for magical nonsense. Well, we came home to an empty house full of diapers and a crib and baby toys. Walked around like two ghosts. And at one point, I went and looked out our front window. And on our walkway leading up to our house was a tiny pair of silver baby shoes. It looked as if an angel had appeared and then abruptly alighted. I wandered around a bit and thought, should I tell Stephanie about this? I looked again, they were gone. That resistance began to rise up in me. If this is a miracle, this is the wrong miracle. I'm trying to survive, I'm not looking for magic. But that resolve started to get loosened during the burial service. Because as we were standing out there at the cemetery, surrounded by community, family, love, and they were just speaking the final words, a flock of chimney swifts flew over our head and then curled and flew back. The very birds that my grandfather studied, in fact, descendants of the flocks that he tracked. And it felt like a miracle. I realized I had to stop analyzing and receive. Some people call this a God moment. You know, maybe God is in the details, in the miracle of existence, in the beauty of nature, in community, in the love between people, in children, in the delighted chirp our cat makes when she sees me walk into a room. And what are yours? Think about what things bring you a sense of awe and wonder. What connects you to something that just may be God? And are you arguing with that? Or are you willing to try to receive it? Well, I'm going to end with a quote that I found. And interestingly, I spent a long time trying to find who had written the quote. And I never found it, which is sort of interesting because it makes it feel like this universal thing, as if it was written by all of us and none of us. And it goes like this. In case you forgot, we live on a planet where whales sing songs that travel for miles, where trees can recognize their own offspring and protect them underground, where dolphins give each other names and where lightning causes sand to turn into glass, where horses can read human emotions, where rain has a smell before it even arrives, and where an ocean can glow in the dark. A planet where the stars we see might not exist anymore. Amen.